coming today, and it's really a great pleasure to introduce Ileana Jiménez, who's come all the way from the US, not just for this seminar, but you're visiting anyway, and we're very, very lucky to have her here. She has done lots of work on social justice in her role as a teacher for 17 years in the US, at a really interesting progressive school that she's going to talk about, the Little Red School and the Elisabeth Irwin Centre. And all her work is involved in social justice issues, and she teaches feminist, gender and queer studies at the school, which is for older children, 15 to 18-year-olds. So she's also created a feminist blog since 2009, which we're all going to get on as soon as the session's finished and have a look at. I'm really thrilled to have her here talking about feminist and social justice issues at high school level. So just to say as well, you created the blog, didn't you, to sort of bridge the gap between teachers, academics and activists, and I think that's a really sort of noble kind of idea. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you so much for coming out. I know that you had kind of a heavy, intense day with kind of inspection and having to perform and at a high level. I completely understand that as a teacher. We definitely have those moments where administrators are walking in without an announcement, or what they call self-studies, where you have an entire team of people coming to observe you and essentially evaluate your work. So I really appreciate everybody coming tonight. And thank you also for inviting me. Especially to Louise, who I met several years ago at a conference at Bryn Mawr College, a women's college outside of Philadelphia, and I felt like I had met a person from my tribe, and it's really hard for teachers like me, feminist teachers in high schools, to find their tribe sometimes, and often it's the people who are in your tribe tend to be in academia, and so I think that part of what I've tried to do, as was mentioned, was I launched this blog called Feminist Teacher back in 2009 because I knew that there were K through 12 teachers out there doing this work, but we didn't know where we were. And so I was trying to bridge the gap between feminist teachers in the K through 12 classroom, academics who were doing this work, and then of course activists who are on the ground but aren't necessarily talking to academics or teachers. So today what I'm going to share with you is actually a presentation that I did in the fall, this past fall, at a symposium that I helped to host with the American Association of University Women. And basically the AAUW invited me to put together a symposium for teachers just like me. K through 12 teachers who are doing feminist work in schools, but who are kind of acting in isolated pockets throughout the US, not knowing that we all exist and not knowing that there's actually a network. Because I started my blog, I get emails almost every day asking for help. How can I bring gender studies to schools? How can I bring women's studies to schools? How can I bring queer studies to my classroom? And so I wanted a space for teachers to come together and share their resources, to present. I wanted academics to come together, and I wanted activists to come together for this hybrid event, first of its kind really in the US. So that's a presentation I'm going to do. If you tweet, I'm Feminist Teacher, feel free to use that handle, and the hashtag that I created is HS Feminism, High School Feminism, in case that's of interest. So one of the things that I kept talking about during this particular symposium was that we need to launch, or perhaps even relaunch, a movement to bring women's and gender and queer studies to schools. And it seems to me that we are not the first people to do this. It seems to me that this actually existed in the not so recent past, but somehow throughout various political machinations that were anti-feminist throughout the last kind of 30 years, particularly in the US, it has been stamped out for various reasons. And of course, it's also the education reform movement in the US that is all about kind of standardized tests and kind of tying tests to teacher kind of salaries and kind of hiring and tenure and all these things that kind of don't allow for innovation and social justice to be addressed. So I think it's time to launch a movement together, and to bring together the three kind of pillars that I think will make this work. I think it's going to kind of come about by teachers, and these are actual people that I know, and who are actual people at the symposium. Wazina Sandan is actually a sex educator in Brooklyn. The middle person is Janetta Candelario. She is a Latin American Studies and Women's Studies professor at Smith College, where I went to school. The last woman is Noela Cabral. She is the founder of an organization called FAN Male, F-A-A-N Male, and basically she works with young women of color in Philadelphia on addressing sexualization in the media, as well as doing various activist work in the media for young women of color to kind of talk back at racist and sexist messages. So these were the three types of people that we brought together for this symposium, and my vision is that these are the people who are going to bring about this movement. Part of what I wanted to do as part of this symposium was to actually bring actual activists to the table. So we invited people from FanMail, Nuela, Spark. Spark is a US-based movement, although it's beginning to become known globally. It stands for Sexualization, Protest, Action, Resistance, Knowledge. And basically it was launched in the fall of 2010 at CUNY. The CUNY Hunter, and two women who you might know, Lynn Michael Brown and Deb Tolman, were a part of kind of addressing sexualization of women in the media through their research. And they wanted to bring this work to teachers, to young people, to kind of grassroots work in the classroom. How can we bring young women and even male allies to the table to basically launch a movement against the sexualization of women and girls in the media? So that's Spark. Girls for Gender Equity is a Brooklyn-based local organization in New York that works with young women of color in New York on issues of gender equity, sexual harassment, what we call Title IX policy issues in schools to address sexual harassment and other types of inequities. So these are some of the people we invited to the symposium. I also partner with a lot of other kind of academic as well as media partners. The Barnard Center for Research on Women is an excellent resource for me. It's right in New York. Barnard College is a women's college, and they have a really excellent lineup of events and initiatives that come out of their work. They even have a zine collection in their library, a feminist zine collection, and they very much believe in supporting kind of K through 12 feminism. Ms. Magazine, which I think everybody in this room knows about, started a digital archive of their work. And when I say digital archive, I'm not talking about their blog. I'm talking about an actual digital archive of their past magazines. You can actually go online, and they've actually kind of, they're marketing this really for professors, but I was the first teacher to bring this into the classroom, to use this resource in the classroom with young people. And basically it's a way to get young people to have a kind of free subscription to Ms. and looking at these digital archives online and getting them kind of interested in how to look at the media through the Ms. Magazine lens. And obviously Ms. Magazine is not the only feminist online source or platform out there, but this is a classroom tool that they've created that I think works really well. The Miss G project, I'm sure you've heard about, is from Canada. They launched basically, essentially their own movement, their own campaign to bring gender and women's studies to schools in Ontario. And it took them 8 years to get this passed through pretty rigorous, persistent, determined kind of campaigning, lobbying of their politicians in Ontario, and they finally did get that passed. If you go onto the Miss G Project website, I think you can download the curriculum and what they were able to implement. So we invited all of these people to the symposium as well. We also invited men. So important to have men in the conversation. We invited an activist from Men Stopping Violence. There's lots of kind of male-based feminist organizations in the US. One of them is Men Stopping Violence. There's another one called Men Can Stop Rape. Michael Vargas, who is probably doing some really great work in St. Louis. The Hazelwood School District in St. Louis, we found out through our research, is, I think, maybe the first school district in the US to have an actual policy that was passed recently to bring a women's studies program into the classroom for their high school students. So he's one of the first teachers to actually teach this class. That's it's a kind of district-wide approved class that he's teaching. Jeffrey Winder is from the GSA network. GSA stands for Gay Straight Alliance. There are many GSAs throughout the US. They're basically student clubs, clubs that kind of bring together both queer and straight students to work on LGBT issues in schools together. So he's from the GSA network. There's other organizations like this in the US. Another large one, probably the most premier one, is GLSEN, which stands for Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. And they are really the kind of the top of the line of the work, and so is GSA network. One more thing to say about GSA network is that they do really excellent work on school to prison pipeline. And Jeffrey Winder, I think, is probably one of the most powerful speakers on this issue, which is that what are the ways in which queer youth of color are constantly being the target of kind of policies in schools that eventually kind of push them out of school and kind of criminalize them unjustly. So he's really an excellent activist. Okay, so the goals of the particular symposium, and basically my goals in general whenever I do these talks, is to put together kind of creative innovations between teachers, academics, and activists to work together and to stop kind of these silos and to instead bridge people together, make our work visible to each other. Thank you for talking about my blog. I think it's important that we kind of talk about, how we're doing this work. I intentionally document my work on a blog because I'm not trying to hide what I do. And because my school is very supportive of my work, I feel very lucky and also very privileged to be able to do this work in a very visible way. And because I am in this privileged position, I feel that it's my duty and my responsibility and frankly my obligation to help other teachers do the same, because they don't necessarily have the same voice or opportunity that I do in terms of speaking out. Linking movements. So I am a queer feminist of color. I cannot just talk about feminism alone. I cannot talk about queer issues alone. I cannot talk about race or ethnicity issues alone. I talk about all these things together. So when I talk about feminism, I'm not just talking about gender, and I'm not even just talking about sexuality. I'm talking about all of the different kind of intersectional ways in which we move about in this world. And so when I inhabit a classroom space, I'm not just a feminist, I'm also a woman of color, I'm also a queer person. And those are, I find myself kind of connected to the various movements, and what are the ways in which we can bring these movements to the classroom. So moving from theory to action, high school students are not going to be reading theory every single day. So how can we have young people read the theory as a kind of starting point, a springboarding platform, and then move them into the action that they want to take for the issues that they care about? And then documenting our work through various social media channels on Twitter, using hashtags like TeachGender and High School Feminism. Okay, so this is my vision, and this is part of what I was talking about with Louise earlier. Part of my vision is to bring this kind of work to teacher training programs. It's amazing to me how teacher training does not have anything related to women's gender, queer, or ethnic studies. And social justice has somehow been erased from programs. And I think it's really important to do that for teachers. They're the ones going into the trenches, and we need to bring these various interdisciplinary perspectives to teacher training. Teachers, professors, and activists partnering on research. GGE had an excellent PAR research, participatory action research project that they did on sexual harassment in schools. They actually published it in a book called Hey Shorty. I recently worked on a PAR research project with Deb Tolman from the CUNY Graduate Center on slut shaming. And my students put together basically, they actually created a questionnaire for all of their peers in our school. And basically, not interviewed, but they kind of had their peers fill out this questionnaire on the use of the word slut, slut shaming, sexuality, and they used the data to create a video to share with their peers, and we're going to be launching that that particular video in April. It's also amazing to me that women's, gender, and queer ethnic studies departments don't offer K-12 pedagogy classes. So if you're a women's studies graduate PhD student, often those feminist pedagogy classes are for teaching college students or teaching other graduate students. Why not have a K-12 pedagogy class and a women's studies graduate class, or in a queer studies graduate class, or in a gender studies or ethnic studies graduate class? K-12 education needs that kind of training all around. Schools and districts with women's and gender and queer and social justice programs should link nationally. Often all of these programs are working really quite in isolated pockets. For example, Arizona had an entire ethnic studies program that you probably heard about was banned. And when I say ethnic studies, I mean in Arizona in particular, excuse me, they were bringing kind of a Chicano, Mexican-American curriculum to Arizona high school students, and politicians there, white, racist, mostly male, but of course Jan Brewer, of course, Arizona governor, was a part of this as well, in banning ethnic studies from schools because they saw it as anti-patriotic and anti-U.S. And all these things, and what's the word, secessionist, and it was threatening to secede. The teachers were encouraging their students to secede from the Union. All these things. So this was in the media, and I tell I actually have a whole unit with my 10th grade students on this Arizona issue. And for me, it's not just about gender. Issues of gender and sexuality are linked to issues of race and ethnicity. So when we were talking about this, some of my students said, "Well, that's Arizona." And I said, "Well, no, it's not just Arizona. It's also New York, right? Do we have those programs here?" And so I think it's really important to have these programs linked together. And then partnerships between schools in the US and schools globally. So I just came from a tour of schools in India where I was doing some guest teaching there on kind of bringing feminism to schools. And I just wanted to get kind of a temperature of what it was like to talk about issues of gender with young women and men in India. And it was incredible how receptive the conversations were. I was talking to 8th grade students, 8th grade girls at a girls' school in Calcutta about LGBT issues. And the teacher was in the room while I was speaking. So it's not like I was alone with these students by myself. And I happened to mention this project I had done in Mexico on kind of interviewing queer youth in Mexico. And they zeroed in on that one sentence I said. And the girls said to me, "Ma'am, can we talk about your research in Mexico? Because we really want to know how to address homophobia at home." And they had a series of questions for me about how do I address homophobia with my brother, with my parents, with friends, etc. And it was just a variation on the same theme, which was 8th grade girls very interested in talking about LGBT issues. And when I talked to the high school students about the same types of issues, they were all ready with their own analysis, for example, of the recent restoration of 377, the Indian Penal Code, which criminalizes homosexuality in India. So I'm, just as someone who's gone around to India and Mexico and Argentina recently, I'm convinced that there is a global movement and a global kind of right temperature right now to do this kind of work. And I invite all of you to work on this together with me and with each other. I'm going to take a sip here. Because I do think that right now, young people are really on target with this and have a lot to say. So a little bit about my blog, Feminist Teacher. As I said earlier, I started it to bridge silos between educators, academics, and activists. I also wanted a space to create K-12 as a viable space for women's studies, and to engage young people in feminist activism and advocacy. And to talk about how feminism can actually connect to actual everyday student concerns. And it wasn't just something kind of theoretical over here in a scholarly journal, but something that could be used by young people to address the actual concerns that they care about. Street harassment, sexual harassment, racism in a store. When a young man of color walks into a store in New York, immediately he is followed. Why? Because they think he's going to steal something. How can he use a feminist intersectional kind of social justice framework to begin discussing his experience, tell his story, narrate his story? I also started the blog because I really wanted teachers to be seen as public intellectuals. I think often teachers are talked about, but we don't do any talking. And I basically took a risk and said, I'm going to start this blog to put out what I think are ideas that should be addressed in education, but are not being talked about by the mainstream media, by politicians, by policymakers, etc. And I wanted to kind of say, we're doing this work in a really important way, and I'm going to make this visible. I think you also wanted me to talk a little bit about the kind of school I work in. Okay, so I feel very lucky that I teach in a very progressive, social justice oriented school. It was started, the Little Red Schoolhouse, you may know, it's kind of has a really kind of storied, interesting, rich history. Elisabeth Irwin was an out lesbian in the 1920s. She actually went to Smith, which is where I also went to college. And she was actually a part of the circle of progressive educators who were part of John Dewey's kind of progressive education movement. And he had a number of women who kind of were his proteges and kind of fellow educators. And Elisabeth Irwin was one of the women who started schools in New York City. So another school that was started out of the progressive education movement was Bank Street School of Education. Another school was the Little Red Schoolhouse, which is the K through 8 part of the school where I work. It was started as a public school in New York City. And then after kind of run-ins with the government during the Red Scare, it became a private school because the New York, well, I don't think that was a direct result, but as a varying result of kind of being scrutinized as a red school, as a commie school, as a communist school, teachers are being essentially accused of being communist. And actually the head of school testified before Congress during this time, trying to protect the identities of his teachers. And then in 1941, the high school was founded, and the students themselves named the school after Elisabeth Irwin herself. And that's where I work. I work in the 9th through 12 high school. When I say 9 through 12, I mean students between 15 and 18 years old. My actual background is in literature, so I was an English major. I teach English. I teach this course on feminism in the English department. So I think that's important to say, which is that I'm a high school English teacher. Okay, so part of what I've tried to do is to move the needle in the conversation in terms of bringing women's and gender studies to schools by actually appearing in the media itself. And I know that we probably have different ideas about what that means, but the Melissa Harris Perry Show, I think, is one of the most interesting and progressive news commentary shows that we have right now. I wouldn't say it's a news show, I would say it's more of a commentary. And what she has is she usually has like 4 panelists on this show from varying perspectives. And during one particular episode, I was invited to talk about safe schools. So when I say safe schools movement in the US has to do with addressing safe school climate issues such as sexual harassment, bullying, online bullying, things like that. And I also talked about the feminism class that I teach as a way to address bullying, which is that if you actually have these kinds of courses in schools, it's a way to use the curriculum as a way to kind of combat all kinds of issues of prejudice, discrimination, racism, sexism, that obviously contribute, those are the root kind of issues of bullying. I think when we talk about bullying, we often kind of don't talk about the root systems that are at play. So that was one opportunity that I had, and I feel very lucky to have done that. So how do I do this? as a high school English teacher. On the very first day, I asked the students, I don't even give out a syllabus, although I have a syllabus prepared kind of in the background. On the first day, I actually had the students just write for about an hour on the following questions. What does feminism mean to you? The students, by the way, are 16 to 18 years old. They're juniors and seniors in a mixed class, girls and boys. What does feminism mean to you? What are your associations with feminism? There's no right answer to any of these questions. How does feminism matter today? Why are you taking this particular course when you could have chosen some other English elective? What do you want to learn more about? I collect all of these and I kind of use them, I use their answers actually as the overview to my syllabus. So every single year the overview kind of changes according to what they say, and then I try to shape the syllabus according to their interests, and as well as things that I already have in mind for the class. And after teaching this for some time now, I kind of know what it is they're going to say. But I want them to have the opportunity to feel that they are a part of the creation of the course. I feel that that's a part of feminist pedagogy, to include students in kind of creating the vision and the trajectory, the arc of the class. Okay, so the philosophy behind the class is these different kind of cornerstones. I'm an English teacher, so there has to be blogging, or there has to be writing in some way. So I do that via a blog that they all have, social media. We read a lot of theory. I do give them kind of very high-level readings. I'm trained in literature, but I actually designed the course to be interdisciplinary. So it has literature, history, art history, media, activism. These are, if you think of like a Lazy Susan, right? The Lazy Susan kind of has all these different like appetizers on it, and when you kind of roll it around the table, you get a different little appetizer. And I have created the course to have these different appetizers of feminism, because I feel that I'm not teaching feminism, I'm teaching feminisms, and the different ways in which feminism kind of manifests itself across different disciplines, fields. I don't want them to feel like feminism only has one face, in particular my face. It's one face, but there are many faces in many ways. And I also use it as a forum to engage them in a kind of a civic way. Like, how can feminism in the classroom engage young people in civic engagement, in public speaking, in becoming actual actors out in the field? My students sit on various panels. After they take this class, they've sat on panels, they've appeared on television, they've marched down the street. In what ways have they become public actors after taking this class? It's not just theory, it's also action. Partnerships with academics and activists. I feel very lucky that I live in New York. There are lots of activists, feminist activists in New York. There's lots of academics I can reach out to, but I also encourage people who are not necessarily in New York to do the same kind of work with other local organizations and to reach out and make those partnerships happen. So those are kind of the cornerstones of the class. As I said, the theory that I do in the class, as a woman of color myself, a lot of the work that I give my students is actually, the readings I do are women of color feminism, US based, but also I give them global readings as well. And I give them kind of these more classic second, third wave readings, Audre Lorde, Judy Moraga, Gloria Anzaldúa, the Combahee River Collective, Bell Hooks, Patricia Hill Collins, Kimberly Crenshaw, mainly to give them kind of the more kind of classic background on women of color feminism. Why? Because so many of my students are students of color. And even for white students who are in the classroom, I want them to have that intersectional perspective. And I also give them more contemporary readings of today's kind of feminists, both white and of color. Just so they can get a contrast between what is being talked about today, which is usually similar to kind of these more classic pieces. Okay, so as a teacher, I need to have them do writing and reading. And if you go on their blog, which is called F to the Third Power, they named it themselves. The class from the 2010 named it themselves. And it's basically, it's an aggregate blog, so every single student blogs on the same blog. what I did was I invited editors from Feministing, and Feministing is a very recognized US-based young feminist blog. And I invited their editors to come in and do a workshop for my students on how to create a blog. And that was in the fall of 2010, which happened to be the same fall that the Spark, the Spark movement started as well. So they were able to kind of blog about that right away. They called it Up to the Third Power. They went on to the Spark Summit and blogged about what it means to address sexualization of women in the media. In 2012, the class blog was viewed over 10,000 times, and actually that number is much higher now. And in 55 countries. So this is not just like a little high school blog that's sitting somewhere. We actually have subscribers. And I tell my students, you have subscribers in the same way that The Nation has subscribers, or Ms. Magazine, or any other kind of professional online or print media. So are you going to publish posts or pieces that are poorly written, or that are poorly researched, or that are, no. You have to have proper, accurate phrasing. You have to have strong research. You have to have links. You have to have links that work. You have to have photos. You have to credit those photos. So this is actually, I feel like, in many ways, I'm editing a magazine or some kind of online media, in that that's another component of this job, which is it's not just that I'm teaching, I'm also editing their work, not their ideas, but I want to make sure that once we hit publish, that those pieces are thoughtfully put together. And they're so well known, this blog is so well known, that they've actually been cross-posted on other feminist blogs, such as the F-Bomb, which was started by initially a teenager in Ohio, and is now a senior student at Barnard. Feministing has cross-posted the students with the Women's Media Center. So it's well known, and the students' posts have been republished. This is it. This is After the Third Power. It has a different look right now, a different kind of banner photo, but this is basically what the blog looks like. And this is what I grade. The students' blog, I read this. They don't actually get to hit publish, I do. So they put their pieces up on the back end of the blog. I read through it, I make sure everything is accurate, and then I email them and I say, you need to rephrase this paragraph, or you need to find another link, or you find a photo, or whatever. Once everything is done, I then publish it if it is publishable. And that's what I grade. That's basically the assessment for the class. There are other assessments as well, but this is the main assessment. Other things that I do, as I mentioned, I have activist partnerships. The main one that we have is with GEMS, and there's also Hollaback, which I'm sure most of you have heard about. There's a Hollaback London. It's an international anti-street harassment movement. Spark is another one that we go with. So, excuse me. GEMS is our partnership with an organization that's the only New York State group that fights against the commercial sexual exploitation of children, CSEC, which basically is sex trafficking. So, GEMS actually has their own documentary. And the founder of the group, Rachel Lloyd, wrote a memoir about her own experience. She's British. She was trafficked in Europe. And I use her memoir in my class as one of the texts. I show her documentary. And then I also have outreach workers come into the class who are survivors themselves of commercial sexual exploitation of children. And they talk about their experiences. They talk to the students. They demystify what sex trafficking is. They talk to the students about the difference between prostitution and being sexually exploited as children. We had a fundraiser one year where we collected clothing for the children of the survivors. The woman in the middle actually is my boss. So that's the principal of the school where I work. And she is the most supportive person that I know in terms of this work. She is extremely supportive of me and the class that I teach. I can go into her office at any time and say to her, I really want to do X, Y, and Z with my students. And I think that the piece here that is really critical is to have that administrative support. This was our visit to the GEMS office during our during the first year that we partnered with them, and this was actually quite unusual because their address is not published. And so they really trusted us to come into their space and to meet their survivors. So this is Rachel Lloyd. I'll show you a picture of Rachel Lloyd. So this woman here is Rachel Lloyd. She's British, and she was trafficked and is now a survivor and started GEMS. She wrote this really powerful memoir. And because I'm an English teacher, I need text in the classroom, right? It's not just blogging. I need text in the classroom, and so Girls Like Us is one of the books that we read in the class. These are my actual students, and they're wearing Dare to Use the F Word Feminist t-shirts from the Barnard Center for Research on Women, and this was actually after a book talk that Rachel had given at our school. Excuse me. Rachel came and talked about her work with GEMS. My students got up on stage and interviewed her, very kind of Oprah book club style. And they were the ones who put together this assembly. I didn't go up there on stage. It was completely student driven. And this is part of what I mean by kind of having students be the actors in this work, which is that I want them to do this work and to feel passionate about it. And they do. They put together these fantastic assemblies for the entire school. The very first year that we did this partnership, we were in a video that GEMS put together, and they had people who wanted to participate download these signs that said, "You will survive," or "I'm a survivor." And this is an early class of this particular course that I teach. As you can see, there are boys in the class. And we were in this video that they did, and do I have time to show you the video? Okay, here it is.
This is to mother you, to comfort you and get you through when your nights are lonely, through when your dreams are only blue. This is to mother you. Kiss you too. For when you need me, I will do what your own mother didn't do, which is to mother you. All the pain that you have known, you through when your nights are lonely, through when your dreams are lonely
So this song and the video was used as a fundraiser for GEMS, and every time someone downloaded the song, it provided funding to GEMS directly, and they did this call for people to send in these photographs of themselves or with their family members, and I did this with my students and sent in the picture, and they used it in the video. Another partnership we've had in the past is with Holla Back. As I said before, it's an anti-street harassment movement. There's a Holla Back London, Holla Back New York, Holla Back Delhi, Holla Back Mexico City, Buenos Aires, etc. And they kind of work on these issues. One of my students, and Emily May, who's the founder of Holla Back, invited my class to testify at the first street harassment it was before the New York City Council, and basically these are kind of like politicians who represent New York City and the mayor, and they were having the first ever street harassment it wasn't a hearing, but it was a kind of a council to listen to activists and young people on this issue, and one of my students, Grace, was able to share her experience of what it means to be harassed on the street, on the subway. She shared this very kind of personal story of public masturbation that had happened to her on the subway and how much it horrified her. And that was part of that hearing. I was going to show you the video of her being interviewed by CBS, but it's not available in the UK, so I can send you the link and you can read the article that was written about that. And this picture here is her kind of sharing her testimony during that hearing.
Happens all the time on the subway.
This is going to come out now.
My friends,
in any public venue.
But my students created this video about street harassment, and the sound is awful, but it didn't quite embed the right way. And as you can see, these are young people, girls and boys, talking about street harassment.
At least 3 times a day, it's a major issue every day. Older men, they stay.
I'm sorry about the sound.
Trying to get us sexually towards me on the street. I never understood fully what it meant.
You could see the victim violated or uncomfortable.
I could be wearing a potato sack, and I would still be
Someone who follows you.
So what I do when I come out is make out,
Hollers at you anywhere, anytime.
Witness it, tell me you're stopping.
Harassers.
One of the things that I do is I try to convince my students in blog media, using Facebook, Twitter, all of these things are so fight back against old-time misogyny and old-time sexism,
Helping empowering
street harassment.
Find a way of showing people how close street harassment is to that.
Website, which is iHollaback.
You are not alone.
So my apologies for that. But that was a video that they created together to talk about street harassment, boys and girls. Spark, which I've mentioned, is a movement against the sexualization of women and girls in the media. Spark has its own blog as well, and my students have been published on this particular blog. There's an application process, and they also have like a feminist retreat that they do with their Spark bloggers, and they kind of train them on how to use the media to talk back to the media. And this is actually run by Spark, which was, as I said earlier, started by Deb Tolman and Lynn Michael Brown, and the executive director now is a woman named Dana Adele. And we work a lot with Spark because they basically engage young people directly with actions. One of the actions that they had was, and these are two of my students, Emma and Karina, and one of the actions that they had was they wanted to basically address the photoshopping of women in teen Vogue, as well as address the fact that there wasn't a variety of different types of women, body sizes, different races, different ethnicities, things like that. And so they gathered a kind of diverse group of girls who were Spark bloggers and activists, and there they are marching down the street in New York City with these signs. And it wasn't just that, they actually secured a meeting with Teen Vogue editors, and they sat down with these editors and said, this is what we want out of your magazine. Unfortunately, the Teen Vogue editors did not treat them very well, and were kind of rude and wound up kind of shoving a stack of magazines saying, well, look, we do have women of color, or we don't do these things. And obviously, our students had very savvy answers for that. And not only that, not only did they have savvy answers, but they wound up going on CNN and CBS and Good Morning America and all these other kind of media outlets to say, actually, Teen Vogue, you're wrong. And they wound up kind of stirring up a lot of kind of conversation around what are the ways in which girls internalize these messages in the media about body image, about self-esteem, about eating disorders, about images of themselves and their sexuality. These magazines are largely heteronormative, largely white, largely kind of skinny girls walking around, and so they wanted to address that. Another part of my work is global. As I mentioned before, I just came from a tour of schools in India, and the main partnership I have is with a girls' school in Calcutta, and they have a really excellent principal. Her name is Indrani Ganguly, and she was a part of my Fulbright cohort back in 2011, and she and I kept in touch over the years, and we decided to do a partnership around International Day of the Girl, and she connected me to one of her faculty members, basically kind of feminist teacher in Calcutta, and their girls did a whole project on International Day of the Girl. My students did one on International Day of the Girl as well, particularly covering issues such as sex trafficking, infanticide or sex selection, girls' education in general globally, and we shared our resources across Skype, blogging, Dropbox. This was my partner teacher in Calcutta. When I went to visit, she and I partnered together to put together a week of lessons for the students when I was just there several weeks ago. My students back at home also put together their own International Day of the Girl assembly. And you can kind of see a little bit in the corner here one of the images that they created, excuse me, on intersectionality. So they taught their peers what they had learned in the feminism class, and they said, we have learned about intersectionality. And they basically kind of taught the school the theory, and then after that, the girls shared narratives, personal narratives about their experiences of racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. And then this year, I was able to bring the class to the UN, and for an International Day of the Girl event there, and they sat at these are my students. So they were sitting there in front of these like screens, which made them feel very special, and it was like hashtag IDG 2013, and that particular event. In front of them were basically girl activists who had been selected from around the world to share their work with this audience. And they felt just extremely lucky to be a part of this event. And they wound up blogging about it. So if you go onto After the Third Power and go onto their International Day of the Girl blog post, you'll see what their thoughts were about this event. So boys are feminists too, and this is true, it's extremely important. A lot of people think that I only work with girls, but I can't only work with girls in a co-ed school. And every single time that I teach this class, boys sign up. No one is making them sign up. This is a totally elective class. They sign up completely voluntarily. And the reason why they sign up is for what I think are pretty excellent reasons. So as I said earlier, on that first day, when they come into the classroom and I say, why are you taking this class? These are their usual answers. They usually say, my mom is a feminist, and I think I want to be a feminist too, but I don't know how. Can a guy be a feminist? And if so, what does that mean? where's the like sign-up card? They are sick and tired of toxic masculinity. They know it. They know they've been given basically pretty damaging, destructive messages about masculinity, and they have this hunch that this class will address that. And they're right. They want to engage, as some feminists call kind of male allies. You know, what does it mean to be a part of a feminist movement as a man? And these are various boys who have taken the class throughout the years. Very diverse group of boys throughout the years. In fact, the boy at the bottom is a transgender boy. So there's a whole range of types of students who have taken this class. One year, the class was invited to do a TEDx talk. There's a girls' school in New York called the Hewitt School, and the first year that they had done this TEDx, I think it was called TEDx Youth event, and the girls and the guys got up and shared a story about their feminist clique, the moment where they had an epiphany that they were feminist. And this is a whole range of different types of students here, from one young man of color who's also gay, here's Grace, who testified in the street harassment hearing. So there's this particular boy actually had shared a story about why he was taking the class. His mom had been a single mom, and the reason why he was taking the class was so that he could be a better man and a better father. And that was his reason. So they shared those stories. That was several years ago. They're now all in college, so I can show you this picture. Just last year, or now it's almost 2 years ago, we were invited by Nickelodeon, which is a children's television channel. I think you might get it here in the UK. Linda Ellerby has a show called Nick Muse, and she had Gloria Steinem on as a kind of special guest, and Nickelodeon wrote to me and said, "We hear you teach this feminism class to high school students. Can you send some students to us?" And my student Nathaniel represented us very well and talked about all the readings he had done in the class. And what does it mean to be a young man of color who's also a feminist? For International Day of the Girl, boys are also a part of the assembly. That particular year, the boys wanted to share their learnings on global girls' education, and so they shared kind of statistics that had kind of really moved them on the lack of education that girls are receiving globally. Noel is probably my kind of star feminist, and he sat on an AAUW panel on sexual harassment in schools last spring at the Commission on the Status of Women at the UN. It was one of these parallel events, and he talked about what does it mean for a young man of color to be addressing sexual harassment. How does he stop that in a classroom setting? How does he stop that in a school setting? Why is it his responsibility to be a part of stopping sexual harassment in schools? So as I said earlier, the class allows for not just theory and reading and blogging, but also action. You may have heard of the I Need Feminism meme that came out of Duke University. The professor, Rachel Seidman, had started this meme with her women's studies class at Duke, and it became this kind of global meme online. And my students were a part of contributing to the meme as well, and they blogged about why they need feminism as young people. So, how else will I see the truth? And then what I shared with the teachers at the symposium was that I wanted them to kind of know what I thought were my best practices. Action-based projects that builds from theory and partnerships with activists and scholars, bringing in intersectional lens, not just gender, not just sexuality, but also race and class, ethnicity, and religion. I feel like sometimes religion is like the bad word sometimes, and the students come from varying backgrounds. I had a student who is both Palestinian and Italian, for example, and was influenced by both her Catholic and kind of Arab Muslim background. Invite speakers. This is really important in terms of, bringing in varying perspectives. I'm not the only face of feminism for my students. I think it's really important for teachers to publish. I don't think we're enough. There's not enough of us who are really contributing our voices to the media. I think this is really important. Write an op-ed. Write for the local paper. Do something to make your work visible. Write for the teacher journals. There's plenty of teacher journals out there. English Journal is one of them. The National Council for Teachers of English publishes scholarly work by teachers. Have students engage in online and offline discourse. That's feminist, that's queer, that's anti-racist. And then what I also did, because this was a symposium, I wanted them to find somebody in the room who was an academic to kind of collaborate with. I wanted them to find an activist. I wanted them to speak to their administrators and district leaders on how to bring this work into schools. I wanted them to teach themselves and their students to engage in the media, blogging, social media, etc. Teachers publish a piece, create a national network, and we actually did wind up creating a listserv. There were this particular symposium, we attracted 50 or 60 teachers from across the country. This is my contact information. The blog is at the top, Twitter, the hashtag, Facebook, and email. Thank you so much for being so patient and for listening and engaging. I'm open to questions if there's time.
That's great, thank you very much.